Hi everyone and welcome to a new episode of Swisspreneur. Today we're going to have a chat with Cédric Waldburger about what makes a good startup team. He will share his personal experience as a parallel entrepreneur as well as his insights as an investor. Now let's have a chat with Cedric and find out what success factors create great startup teams. Before we get started with the episode, I would like to introduce you to SBB Startup. If you think that your company is a good fit for the Swiss Railways, get in touch with them or learn more about their startup programs at sbbstartup.com. Cedric, welcome to the second episode. It's really great to have you again. And today we're going to talk all about teams. I would like to jump into the first question right away. What mistakes do you see Swiss startups making over and over again when it comes to teams?
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Super happy to talk about that topic. I've been involved in quite a few different teams in different roles, both as an employee or consultant, as a co-founder, and also as an investor. And it's definitely a very interesting and also dynamic topic. I don't think I've seen as many surprises in any other area of startup life. To come back to your question, Swiss startups and teams, maybe I haven't seen enough closely enough, or maybe there is no commonality, but I don't think there's the typical Swiss startup. I think it all depends on what backgrounds the founders and the early team members bring to the table. But one thing that I can share that was not obvious to me and that I've recently learned after starting this company or after being involved with Dfinity early on. Something that I've seen previously is that sometimes when you get together as a founding team or early employees, usually the earlier you join, the higher up in the hierarchy you end up in your startup. So I've seen people being named CTO, even though they've had very little programming experience in the past, or CPO, product officers. And sometimes that's not great for the company, right? You see, just because you were there first does not mean that later on, when the startup can actually afford to attract someone that has a lot of knowledge in that, or target expertise, domain expertise, it might be better for you, even though you were early, to step aside and give someone with more experience that role and pick a new project where you can provide more value. So one thing that we do at Dfinity is there's almost no titles and no hierarchy, even now that we've reached 60 plus people. Wow. And one thing that does is it keeps things very dynamic. And from what I've seen so far is it helps people being placed at or in a role where they can provide the most value. So if, like, very early on, when we were 5 or 6 or 7 people, maybe there was some temptation to take all these titles and have chief this and that. Mm-hmm. I think it was a super wise decision by our founder to keep us from doing that and just keep everyone's titles and roles very, very flexible and dynamic. Mm-hmm. Because now that we've grown and we've attracted some investment and we get a lot of inbound applications for jobs, we've been able to fill some of the roles with very, very experienced people. For example, our VP of engineering, Mac, who leads our engineering team, extremely experienced, has 30 plus years of experience in exactly this space. And I think it would have been much harder to bring him in if we had some sort of a more formalized structure before that, and wouldn't have been able to offer him this position.
A formalized structure also gives you some sort of guidance, I could imagine. How do you deal with that? Like, how do you give people still guidance while having a very dynamic environment? And how do you decide which person you put into sort of which role when that changes all the time?
Yeah, I think it's a fine line, and I think that's exactly the trade-off. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer, but I can tell you about how we approach it. So one thing is, even as we grew, we tried to have people centralized, meaning we tried to get people to come to the office and talk to each other and see each other. So when you need to make a decision, it's very easy for you to talk to everyone that should be involved in that decision. And second, to also define stakeholders for projects. Let's say we release a new website, and I need to know who's going to sign off on the content for this page or that page, right? So it's more of on a per project kind of basis instead of having a formalized structure over the whole company. And then also we realized that now that we're approaching 60 to 100 people, it is time to formalize at least part of it, knowing that things will still stay in flux and will still change, but it is very helpful to remember that things will have to be a bit more defined now that not everyone can know everyone else in the company.
In that regard, which parts would you structure first or give a better guidance first?
I think it depends a lot on the project. So for us, our core departments are definitely research and engineering. And so those are the ones that we structured first because we needed them to be more efficient immediately. That's just where it's fail or success for Dfinity. Whereas operations and some other support departments and roles, I think can be a bit more fluid because we're also not growing them as quickly as we are growing the engineering team, for example.
Mm-hmm. From what I understood now is there are different phases of a company, like when they just founded the company, there are different people involved and different roles. And then the bigger you get, the more you can also start to scale up. There are also new challenges that you face and new adaptations that you have to make to fit the new environment. How does this sort of, if I can call it, company life cycle look from your perspective in order what people should be involved with and what roles they should have from beginning to the, let's say, end, in meaning having a very big successful company?
I think it was Ben Horowitz who wrote this book, Hard Things About Hard Things, which I found a very good source of inspiration, or I think he mentions a lot of very interesting anecdotes in there. And one of the takeaways for me was that all the processes break whenever the company triples. So he says when you go from 3 to 10, from 10 to 30, from 30 to 100 people and so on, basically everything breaks and you need to rebuild processes and structure. Mm-hmm. And that's also kind of like the span of the company size that I've mostly been involved with, 0 to 100 people. And I think it's very true. Like at the beginning, you have 3 people, they're all founders. You want all to be generalists, so everyone should be able to pick up whatever needs to be picked up and get it done. 10 people is when things start to be a bit less general for some roles. I think that's when you can afford to hire 4 or 5 specialists that have a very specific role for the company's success. Mm-hmm. 30 people is definitely when you can have a lot more specialization. And then 100, definitely, you will have probably like 10 generalists in the company and 70 or 90 people that have a very well-defined role and bring a lot of experience to the table in regards to that role. Yeah, I think that would be one of the takeaways for me, or one of my observations looking at these different startups that I've been involved with.
I think that's a nice point of view and also a very great book recommendation that you just gave us there. By the way, also one of the investors in Dfinity, sort of.
Yes, although the partner that led our investment is Chris Dixon, mm-hmm. Who also set up this new fund, A16Z Crypto. So a fund of Andreessen Horowitz that focuses mostly or exclusively on crypto projects. So I've never had the chance so far to interact with Ben Horowitz personally. But yeah, they're very close to our office as well. So one day.
Hopefully that moment will come.
Yes.
Absolutely. Do you also see a difference in how the team should interact with each other? Like thinking about, I don't know, weekly meetings, daily check-ins, whatever has worked there from your perspective, also according to the company size. What are your best practices there?
Yeah, I think, so Dfinity has an office here in Zurich and one in Palo Alto. They're 9 time zones apart from each other. So that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. What are the best practices to make this work, to make it not so frustrating for either party? Mm-hmm. Because typically when people start to work in the US, that's when people here in Zurich end their workday roughly. So you have about an hour or 2 hours of overlap each day. And we need to have processes that make it very efficient. So for us, the way we try to build this is to crowdsource ideas and processes. So we created we created a list of questions that we want to have answered. For example, like when can you book a meeting? What are best practices for how do you attend a meeting, how do you keep meeting notes and all that stuff. But then we crowdsource it from all the employees, also knowing that things will change over time based on experiences that we make. One example that I can give you is, some of it is very common sense, like you should not cancel a meeting less than 24 hours in advance. Every meeting should have an agenda. Every meeting should only be attended by the people that need to be there. So as many as needed, as few as possible. And then maybe some stuff that's a bit less obvious is just we have a few people in Japan as well. So just trying to find that one 30-minute or 1 hour slot that works for everyone around the globe is a bit tricky. Luckily, the people we have in Japan are very flexible and sometimes they work till early mornings. But then we also try to document stuff a lot more so that we don't need as much synchronous time with each other. So for example, stand-ups do not happen company-wide, but they happen per office. So that's maybe one thing that could be a takeaway. Like we believe in synchronizing people a few times per week. Right now, I think we do about 3 stand-ups per week where we synchronize people, and then we do 1 stand-up with the whole company bi-weekly, every 2 weeks. Because sometimes it's also just good to hear each other and listen to the tone of how someone says something. Sure. Because it gives you a different perspective than just Slack and email messages.
Absolutely. How does such a stand-up meeting look like at Dfinity?
I think they're very straightforward. Typically, what I like to do with my team is in advance, everyone writes down their update. So they send an update via Slack and say what they've been working on and what they're going to work on. And then the only thing that we're going to discuss is talking points. So they would say, I've done this, I'm going to do this, and I would like to talk about this. And then we only go through these because I found it doesn't scale really well if everyone gives their update of just what they've worked on, what they're going to work on. During the stand-up, I think that's much better to be done asynchronously via text and then just talk about the issues at hand.
Where you also need other people's input because otherwise it's sort of a waste of their time, right?
Yes.
Cool. You've also, you started your entrepreneurial career quite a long time ago with your friend Fabian that you met during your Boy Scout time.
Yeah.
What made you a good team that you decided to keep on working together for such a long time?
Yeah, so Fabian and I have worked on a number of projects. It all started when we were in the Boy Scouts, and we built a website for our Boy Scouts club or chapter. And back then, of course, we did not think of this as a company or anything close to that. We were just 2 kids. He's 4 years older than I am, so he was about 18 at the time, I was 14. And we just decided to get together on weekends and late nights and start working on websites, logos, corporate identities. And this was 2001, or 2001, 2002. So the time when everyone thought they needed a website but didn't really know why, which was a fascinating time for me as a teenager.
Also quite good market timing.
Yeah, it was a really fun time. And I feel like in some sense similar to what Dfinity is going through now. With last year, we've seen an enormous amount of interest in the crypto markets, which are also largely based on blockchain. And now as the market is declining, there's a bit less interest, kind of like the dot-com bubble happening in 2001, and then some good projects emerging or making it through that crisis, and also a lot of scams and less long-term thinking projects also getting out of the market. But coming back to your question, so Fabian and I, two very different characters. Fabian is very extremely social, great guy, marketing. He studied design or worked as a designer back then. I was definitely an introvert, spent a lot of time on my computers, learned coding very early on in my life, always had fun trying to reverse engineer how a computer works. So we got together and we just had fun. We started building these websites on the weekend. And that's what we did for the first 2 or 3 years. So before Mediasign even became an actual company, we just worked on this as a side project. And every now and then we charged something or we got some money for what we did. But more often than not, we also just worked on something because we had fun doing so.
also sort of a learning experience for you again, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I mean, especially when he would sell stuff or promise stuff that was not really possible, or at least I didn't know how to realize it. Those were sometimes long nights, but also very fun once I got a solution, or once I figured out the solution. Yeah, and then after about 4 years in, when I turned 18, we decided to make it an actual company. There were a few things that contributed to that. One was Fabian wanted to quit his job as a radio host. Mm-hmm. He had sometimes very early shifts, sometimes late shifts, and he was kind of tired of that lifestyle. Plus, we had picked up quite a bit of traction. So there were, back then, remember, I'm a student at this point, so we had a few $1,000 coming in per month from the work that we did. So this felt like a good opportunity as well. So we started and rented an office, put some computers in there, put a photo studio in there. And then I also, the same day that we officially made a company created the company for Mediasign, I also had my first day at ETH. And now looking back, it was quite naive because I always had a very easy time going through school all the way through high school. Mm-hmm. Like math, all the languages, I never really prepared for tests, and I still did pretty well. So my assumption was that now going to ETH, it would be kind of similar. I would just go there every now and then and pick up whatever I found interesting and then just write exams and have a good time. And I was so wrong.
Reality was a bit different.
Reality was very different. I definitely did not do enough research, but I'm kind of happy I didn't do more research, because otherwise I might not have taken on the two challenges at the same time. But I get to ETH, and basically after 2 hours, I realized we had just gone through everything that I knew. And so everything after those first, maybe let's say 2 hours, or maybe it was the first 2 days, but definitely within the first week, I ran out of knowledge, or at least everything that was now coming was new to me, which was super exciting, but also a bit terrifying.
I mean, that's a huge challenge that you face at that moment, right?
It was a fun challenge, yeah, definitely one of the bigger challenges. And what we ended up doing is that Fabian would be in the office during the day, so he would usually cover the day shift, and then I would go to ETH, study during the day, and then get back to Rapperswil, which is a city about 30 minutes from Zurich, where ETH was. Get there, come to the office, high five, we did a quick briefing. And then I would sit down, Fabian would go home, and I would start coding and trying to solve whatever he had solved that day or created that day. A lot of nights that I was alone, but I never felt lonely.
Okay.
So that was a great experience as well, and something that also I think paved the way forward. So Fabian and I we're best friends as well, and we're extremely good at communicating. Even though we're such different personalities, I think we always managed over the years to be very open with each other, to be very straightforward. And I think that's one thing that kept us from getting into fights or mixing friendship with business in a way that it shouldn't be mixed.
How did you sort of do this communication part to make it that successful? How did that happen? Did you have a fixed structure, or did it just happen when you high-fived him and had a quick verbally briefing? How did that happen?
I think for the most part, it was just lucky. I think we have a very similar way of thinking or seeing a lot of things in life. Mm-hmm. So even if we didn't agree on a certain topic, there was always that level that we could go back to where we could still talk to each other. I think that's what I always value in relationships. If you have that common ground that you can always retreat to and still speak the same language, even if you disagree on a certain topic that day. Mm-hmm. So I think to some degree it's luck, and on the other side, it's also being very honest with each other, not giving up on your own opinions and staying at the table until you've found a solution. Something that I've also, it's not that different from how I've found personal relationships to work out best. If you're so invested in the relationship that you're not gonna give up on any discussion, or you're not gonna sacrifice your opinion for the other person. Mm-hmm. You're gonna talk it out, talk through it, and even if it's tough sometimes, find a solution that you're both okay with. Yeah, and then so there wasn't a tool. I think it was mostly just having a common understanding and talking about what we needed to talk about. And that also helped set up the future for how we would work together. So we never actually spent that much time in the same office at the same time. Even after I had completed my bachelor's at ETH, I moved to New York for a bit and to work on another startup called Small World. And now we were 6 time zones apart, which is not that bad, but it often meant that I would get up at 3 a.m. to restart a server or fix some problem that happened. Luckily and fortunately at that point, we also had hired some employees at Mediasign. So we had already made our first experiences with leading people instead of doing the work ourselves. And I was able to delegate a lot of my work and build processes and structures instead. And we learned that if the only tool you have to talk to each other is a phone call or is a Skype call, then it's still better than not talking to each other. So we always value the time where we can have dinner together or be in the same office or at the same table. But we also know that there's going to be situations where that's not possible, and you still need to talk through both fun but also not so fun topics. And I think Fabian and I were always really good at just doing that, just getting stuff out of the way, not having it sit on our desk or in the back of our mind for too long, and just getting to it and finding a solution together.
You were 2 co-founders when you started Mediasign with Fabian. Do you think that this is the ideal number, or would you do anything differently in that regard?
I'm not sure there's an ideal number for any type of business. I think for what we did, it was definitely extremely helpful to be at least 2 people. We were both so inexperienced, so it was great to have someone else that I could use as a sparring partner. Would it have been good to be 3 people? I don't know. I think 2 people also forced us to always come to a common understanding, because no one could, there were no 2 people that could block the other 1 person, right? But I think in general, more than 1 is definitely better. I think what I've seen work really well in a startup in Berlin that I'm invested in is 4 people that are extremely smart, extremely driven, and work extremely well together. Everything beyond that, I've seen a bit of chaos. If there's too many founders, too many people that sometimes also want to make big decisions, I think it can create a lot of noise as well. So I'd say somewhere between 2 and 4 is probably ideal based on my experience, which is obviously a small data set, but still
larger than for a lot of people. When doing research for this episode, there's also a quote that stuck with me that I saw over and over again when thinking about a great founding team. And there it said, having shared values, but complementary skill sets. And what you just described seems to be really have to be the case for you and Fabian. What are your thoughts on this quote?
Yeah, I think it's a great quote. Yeah, I hadn't seen it that often, but I would definitely agree. Yeah, I think the values is probably that meta level that I referred to, where you can always talk to each other, where you're always in common understanding. And then skills should definitely be different. I think not only skills, but also aspirations should probably be a bit different. What I mean by that is, for example, if Fabian and I both would have wanted to get the thank you notes from customers all the time, or be the best salesperson in the company, we would have stepped on each other's toes way too often. But because he was very comfortable being the face of Mediasign, being the salesperson, running events and networking for Mediasign, and I couldn't bother with that. I'd rather spend time on my laptop figuring stuff out, which was something that he didn't enjoy too much. I think that worked out well. So because we had different aspirations, because we had different goals with what we wanted to get out of our role, I think it worked out really well.
Different aspirations could, on the other hand, also mean that you want different things out of life. For example, one founder who wants to build a very, very big company, international company, and the other founder may be feeling more comfortable with having a local shop which is not that big. Do you think that there has to be an alignment about that, or could that also work if you have different aspirations, for example, for the broader company strategy or vision?
I think it's very true what you say, and I think there should be alignment, at least to some degree. Maybe there's also different lifespans for founders, right? Maybe the founding team, if it's 2 to 4 people at the beginning, maybe 5 years in, or even earlier, 3 years in, not all 4 of these people are still at the right place if they're still within that company. Mm-hmm. For example, I personally really enjoy this phase of like 5 to 100 people. And I'm yet to learn how I perform and how I work with companies, or in a company that's like Dfinity, that's soon going to be more than 100 people. Mm-hmm. I really enjoy this phase where you know everyone and you have a personal relationship with everyone in the company. And then also in regards to how big you want to grow the company, I think it's very true that there's different ideas, right? Someone wants to build the next unicorn. Other people want to build a lifestyle business that just gives them as much free time as possible and still supports their lifestyle. One experience that I've made was that was probably 2012 when we started an online tailor. Back then I was living in Hong Kong for a while, and with a guy that I met at the university in Hong Kong, we decided to start an online tailor. You might have heard of companies like UTailor or Indochino. I think there was a time for these kind of companies where they were very in fashion. Mm-hmm. And we decided to build a website where people could measure themselves, pick a fabric, and then we would produce that suit or shirt in Asia and ship it to them. And we opened a little store in Paris where people could come in and get their measurements or touch fabrics. And my aspiration there was definitely to build something that's mostly autonomous. Mm-hmm. So something that would not rely on salespeople, like a pure internet business that would grow frictionless. And then what I realized pretty quickly is that my co-founder had a different aspiration. He wanted to be a salesperson. He liked the interaction with each and every customer. He liked getting their measurements and talking them through it and making it a long process.
So very heavily involved operational.
Yes. And not scaling, not creating a setup that scales quickly. And I think for him, it had a lot to do with quality. I think he believed that the perceived quality of the garment that you're receiving is very connected to the sales experience that you had. And he believed that on a website, you could never have as good of a sales experience as you could have in real life. That was an interesting experience for me because even going into that project, I always knew that we were not 100% aligned. It never was like in other cases, like with Fabian, where I felt there is this common understanding of where we want to get to. Even if we cannot write it down or formalize it, we know we have a similar vision. And this was not the case here. But I thought, because the company or the market and the product seemed so good at the time, I thought it doesn't matter if the team is slightly off or misaligned. And maybe also if not everyone is a rock star or is not feels like that's what they want to do with their life at this point. And it was a very good experience for me because I learned that obviously it did not work at all. Like you as a founding team need to be aligned. You need to be in the same boat. You need to be on the same page. You need to have a common understanding of what the path is. Mm-hmm. Otherwise it will not work. So that taught me a very good lesson as well. The team is everything. Of course, there's product and there's market and everything, but the team is what makes it a success or failure.
I think that's a very good and strong takeaway. How would you describe the values that you and Fabian shared when you started, and did they evolve in any way after several years?
For both of us, we kind of knew back then that Mediasign would be our first baby steps as an entrepreneur. It's a service business. It just inherently doesn't scale as easily as a product business. We were selling websites and corporate identities and that kind of stuff. So we were selling man hours or services that were produced by the hour by some of our employees. So I think we both wanted to grow it to a level of like 10 to 20 people, but we did not want to make this a massive thing because we knew that with more people, there would be more problems as well. There would be more pressure on us to hitting a certain sales target every month, every week. And another thing I think where we were always aligned is that we wanted it to be fun. We wanted it to be something that we're proud of. We wanted to reach a certain quality level. Because we wanted to be able to go out and say, hey, we're building Mediasign and be proud about that and wearing a t-shirt. One thing that I realized pretty quickly is that building these marketing websites and doing project work for clients was not something that I was super passionate about after the first 2 or 3 years after we had made it an official company. And what I really appreciated is that I could talk about it openly with Fabian. I mentioned that to him and we found a solution for that. We started to hire more people. I started to take more of a background role instead of being operationally involved on a day-to-day. And he chose the other path. He was really happy being there day-to-day. And so that worked out really well just because we were able to be so open and always find solutions for any changes that we both wanted to make in our life.
I think this is also a great example that you described earlier, when the founders that started the company realize when they have to evolve or change their roles coming with the time that passes. Have you noticed that in any other company that you were involved with, maybe also that you invested in?
I'm just trying to, I mean, definitely. I'm trying to think of anecdotes that I can share here. One was a company that originally consisted of 5 founders. And very quickly in the first year, everyone realized that there was one out of the 5 that just did not get along with the other 4. He had different ideas of where this company should go, of the culture. And so while raising another round of funding, they actually decided to part ways. And it was a very amicable ending to that story. So it was great. And I think everyone's happier now that I think the person that left was able to find a company that's more aligned with his values. And the other 4 founders, we could immediately see there was so much tension and stress on the 4 members before they parted ways and before they were able to talk it out. Just tension that was produced by this culture clash. So that was one way where it went really well and very early on. Another case, coming back to Fabian and Mediasign, just because we talked about it quite a bit. So about 1.5 years ago, Fabian decided that he also wanted to take a less operational role in Mediasign because he had taken on some other projects and challenges in his life. So we decided to look for someone to take the CEO role and work the day-to-day in the company. And then just last month, we actually sold the business. So we found a CEO that led the business for about a year and then started to look for a buyer and found someone that would happily take over the business as a shareholder and part-time employee or be operational for part of the time. And I think that's another example of where I think because Fabian was able to communicate that his vision or his ideas have shifted, we were able to make adjustments. Of course, it doesn't happen from today to tomorrow. But over time, I think it took us like 3 or 4, 5, 6 months to find someone who was a good fit, put them in the company, provide a transition period, and then finally sell the company with that person being on board still.
Great. Congratulations to this great solution.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, after 16 years of having Mediasign in my life, it was definitely a milestone. Yeah, it was interesting.
Absolutely. What I think is so interesting about you is that you have a very broad set of experience. And one of them is also Sendtask, where you set up a fully remote team in a completely different country, also with people from all over the world. Why did you decide to set up a completely remote team?
Yeah, I think there's so with Sendtask, we had a team of about 13 people in 12 different countries. They're not from all over the world, but they're probably plus minus 3 time zones compared to Central European time. So about 1/3 of the world. And I think there's certain types of businesses that lend themselves really well to being decentralized in terms of where the employees are working from. And there are businesses that are not. For example, with Dfinity, we're creating these hubs where we bring people together because we believe that having people in one room and them spending a lot of synchronized time with each other in front of a whiteboard is extremely valuable. On the other hand, Sendtask, which is a productivity tool, there's not that many hard problems. It's more of you need to make it maybe that sounds wrong. It's not an easy, of course it's not an easy challenge, but there's not as many scientific problems as we have here at Dfinity. So the communication can be a bit less the synchronous communication because we can get together and talk about the roadmap, and then everyone can go back and work on their own and work at their own productivity schedule whenever they feel most productive and when they don't. So in summary, Sendtask is or just to introduce Sendtask real quick, Sendtask is a task manager similar to Asana or Trello or these kind of distributed task management tools. What always frustrated me with using them is that they're only built for my existing team. So when everyone has an account in my company, I can share tasks with them and I can create great accountability and visibility. But whenever I work with an outside agency or when I work with my accountant or lawyer, the people where I should be most careful, right? Because I pay them by the hour and also it's very important stuff, not to miss deadlines. I could not onboard them into Asana or Trello because they would first need to create an account and I would need to explain the software to them. It was not very simple. So we decided to build Sendtask after testing, I think, 48 different products, realizing that none of them offered a very, very frictionless onboarding process. So Sendtask, in a sense, is very similar to the tools that I've just mentioned, but you don't need to have an account in order to start collaborating. So as long as I know your email address, I can send you a task. And for you to respond to that task, you don't need an account either. You just open it from your email and you can leave comments, attachments, complete it, change the due date, and so forth. Cool. Of course, you could create an account and you get access to more features for security reasons. Some of these are hidden behind the account creation, but in general, that's what Sendtask does. And because the idea is somewhat simple to communicate, of course, the devil is in the detail, but like I can tell you as a designer, hey, this is how it should roughly look like. Please come up with ideas and then reiterate from there. Mm-hmm. Or as a developer, if you have the designs and I can give you specs for how it should work, then you can go and it will take you a number of hours or days to implement a certain feature, but usually the road is pretty straightforward, at least in this early stage phase. So that plus that I'm always curious, and I was wondering if you could transfer what I've learned in my personal life that I didn't really need a constant home, if I could transfer that to the business world and create a company without an office, was an interesting challenge or experiment to me. And so we set out and we started Sendtask. Also, I was traveling still a lot of the time, so even if we had an office, we wouldn't have spent that much time all together, just because I was gone a lot of the time. And it was an interesting experience. I think we're going to talk more about benefits and downsides of that model. One of the things, obviously, is that you can hire from almost anywhere. So you get access to a much, much larger talent pool by having a company that allows remote work or remote participation, which I considered one of the biggest benefits when we started working on Sendtask.
And what would be some of the drawbacks that you experienced?
I think an obvious drawback is that it's not as easy to build culture.
Okay. If you don't have the FaceTime.
If you don't spend actual time in the same room, right? Because if I think of how I use Zoom and Skype and all that, and also the reason why I travel so much and even now go to the US very often is because I think Zoom and Skype and all these tools are great to exchange information, to have a 60-minute call and talk about a certain specific topic and come to a conclusion. But they're not so enjoyable that I would just randomly keep my camera open and talk to someone about the movie that they saw last night or last weekend, right? And in order to work together, I think it's very important to see each other not just as employees, but as human beings. right? So that we all are much more complex than the email address or the Slack name that appears on the other person's screen. And so Slack and email and all these tools, they're great to transfer information, but they're not very good at getting a feeling for the other person. And that's why I think it's so important to come together and create experiences together. For example, with Sendtask, what we did, we had a rhythm of getting together every 12 weeks, roughly every 90 days, 4 times a year, where we would fly everyone to the same place somewhere in Europe, and then focus on 2 things. One, work-wise, focus on the hard problems, where we wanted everyone to chime in and participate in a discussion. Usually that involved vision and strategy and high-level roadmap, plus the detailed roadmap. What are we going to work on within the next 12 weeks, and present that to everyone else for feedback. So those were usually the mornings, and then the later afternoons and the evenings, we focused on getting to know each other through various experiences. It could be as simple as going out for dinner together, and it could be as advanced as taking them surprise skydiving. So one day when we were in Berlin, I told everyone we were going to go picnic on a Sunday afternoon. And we picked everyone up, had a little bus, and then we drove to the airport and basically as a surprise went skydiving, which some people really liked. Some people still despise me for after all this time.
I can imagine.
But it was definitely a memorable moment and experience for all of us. And I think those are the, as I said, it doesn't need to be as spectacular every time. It can be a simple dinner. It can be playing an escape room together or even cooking together. But just creating moments that have nothing to do with work explicitly, I think is very important to understand each other.
I saw on TV you also had some pretty rough team sports activities in the morning.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, we usually go and work out in the morning. I think it's just a nice way to also push each other a bit, to start the day fresh and energized. And then also it just naturally keeps people from making their night too late if they know they have to be ready and for push-ups and running at 7 a.m. the next day. Maybe that's the military influence that we talked about in the last episode.
Probably. Did you also see any difference how you have to handle people with a fully remote team? I could think about if someone is, for example, not performing at the level that you expect them, you probably notice that a bit earlier if you have this FaceTime and if you're in the same office, because there are also a lot of not directly objectively communicated aspects to that matter. Did you have any experience in that regard or any problem that you ran into?
What I've learned is a very important skill, independent from what you do at the company, is that you're a good communicator. Mm-hmm. Meaning you need to be able to put your thoughts into words and be very precise. I, as being one of the founders or leaders in Sendtask, what was always very important to me is to be very open, and if I saw any hints of people being slightly off or maybe not feeling well, to just get on a call with them and talk through it. Plus, because it might not always be obvious, as you said, if I see someone come into the office with their heads down, I know something's wrong, which is something that I miss when they're sitting a few hundred kilometers away from me. Mm-hmm. So we did feedback rounds and a lot of writing about every 6 weeks, where we would ask everyone to give an update on how they're feeling, how aligned they feel, but also give feedback for how they think the company could do better or any particular member could do better. Okay. So we just try to be very conscious about that we're losing a certain part of information, pick good communicators and give them a tool to make us know if anything is off.
Mm-hmm. To sum this remote team topic up, do you think that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, or does that depend heavily on the case that you're working on?
I think it does depend on the business that you're building. For Sendtask, it definitely makes sense. I would do it the same way if we had to start over. Mm-hmm. And then for other companies, I think it would not work well. I think an aspect that we left out previously is if your company depends on either physical goods, like actually shipping something or building something physical, hardware, or if you have a very, for example, sales intensive operation where people need to go door to door and they need to just collaborate and maybe have meetings together very often in the same room with a client, then I think it might be better to not have a remote organization.
Okay. I think you've shared a lot of experiences and great learnings with us. Thank you very much for that, Cedric. Is there anything you'd like to add now at the end of the interview that we might have not talked about yet?
Maybe just one more thought that one thing that we did a bit differently in Sendtask, because we were remote, was our hiring process. When I compare it to Mediasign, where it was very unstructured at Mediasign. We would write a job description, publish that, get CVs, and then check each and every CV individually, decide on a few candidates that we wanted to interview via phone, and so on and so forth. At Sendtask, what we realized is that that does not scale too well. Because if you can hire from a lot of time zones and geographies, then you might get a lot of applications. Sometimes we got 600 to 900 applications for a certain role.
Well, that's a lot of work to look at every CV.
Yes, that would be a lot of work. And I think we as human beings, we're also not very good at being consistent with something as tough as deciding if a CV is good or not. I think one book that I've read is Malcolm Gladwell's The Outliers, where he speaks about that bias, or also Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where he talks a lot about how, for example, judges make or judge differently based on how long they've been up. So in the morning, they usually have a different opinion than later in the day because they exhaust their mind. So we knew we couldn't just, it would be quite naive to just try and go through 600 applications by hand and try to find the best in that batch. So we sat together and we thought about what's a good way to go about that. And it was very simple. What we came up with is a very simple tool. We decided to include a tripwire in the briefing. So the briefing would typically take you 5 to 7 minutes to read, about 2 pages. And in the last part of the briefing, we would leave a tripwire, which said, if you're really interested in this job, then make sure the subject line of your email or response is, hey, Cedric, I'm the UX superstar you are looking for. Very simple. Anyone who consciously reads that briefing will get it right? We were able to sort out or filter about 85% of the applicants because they did not get that right. Oh. About 85% of people did not read precisely enough to catch that.
And you probably don't want to work with them, right?
Yeah, we need people, as I mentioned, like we need good communicators. They need to pay attention to detail, especially to written information. So that was a very good way for us to sort out the bad apples really quickly. And then we had a few more steps with Google Forms and a certain way we ask questions. But I think that was one key thing that we learned that saved us a lot of work early on. Yeah, maybe that's just the last anecdote that I wanted to share with your listeners.
I think that's a very smart hack that I'm sure a lot of startuppers out there can actually just use out in their daily business. So again, Cedric, thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing the great stories with us. Much appreciated. And I wish you all the best of luck for your future projects and especially also Dfinity. And I'm very curious what we will hear from you in the future.
Yeah, likewise. All the best with this project and many others. And thanks a lot for having me again.
Thank you.